The building didn't look like a prison. From the outside, it resembled an old farmhouse, tucked into the edge of a German village no one remembered the name of. The windows were either boarded up or painted black. A single rusted hook where a sign used to hang was the only suggestion it had ever been open to the public. But the air around it was too still. No chickens, no workers, no movement, only silence and the faint smell of bleach. Inside, the second floor had been divided into narrow rooms with wooden beds, thin mattresses, and small metal buckets in the corners. There were no mirrors, no books, no clothing aside from what each woman wore. They didn't speak much, only whispered when the guards weren't close. Some had stopped using names. Most answered only when called by number. Laughter had long since vanished from the walls. They were Polish, taken from towns, villages, and cities across the occupied territories. Some had been seized in roundups, others lured with false promises of factory work or kitchen jobs. By the time they realized where they had been taken, it was too late. Escape was impossible. Guards slept near the staircase, and every door had a special lock that clicked from the outside. The clients were Wehrmacht soldiers, mostly passing through on rotation. The women never learned their names. They came in groups or alone, some quiet, others brutal. There was no way to predict what each hour might bring. The women learned to anticipate footsteps by their rhythm. Heavy meant drunk. Light and fast meant a new recruit. Both were dangerous. Days passed in repetition. Wake up, wash, wait, obey, bleed, cry, sleep. Some lost count of time entirely. Others marked it secretly on wooden bedposts, scratches carved with hairpins hidden beneath blankets. One woman, Zofia, counted 218 such days before the pencil she had stolen from a soldier was taken away. The food was just enough to keep them alive. Bread crusts, watery soup, sometimes spoiled potatoes. Illness spread quickly. Medical care was rare. Only when someone collapsed did a doctor come, and only then if she was useful. Fevers, infections, and weight loss became routine. Hygiene was a cruel joke in a place designed to reduce women to shadows of themselves. Pregnancy was another layer of horror. Those who became pregnant were either taken away or made to endure under conditions that broke them slowly. The few who gave birth did so in silence, often alone. No one knew what happened to the babies. They vanished. So did the mothers, sometimes. The building had no clocks, but the women could guess time by the smell of cooking downstairs or the shift of sunlight through the cracks. Some days they were kept busy from morning until night. Other days brought long stretches of nothing, which many feared even more. In stillness, the mind wandered, and memory returned. What they remembered of their lives before the war came in flashes. A mother's voice, a smell of bread, the feel of a warm coat in winter. But those memories had begun to erode. The longer they stayed, the harder it became to believe that a life outside existed. Hope was dangerous. Hope could kill. They learned to fold into themselves, to keep their voices low, their bodies still. To survive, they needed to become invisible, pliant, predictable. Resistance didn't lead to freedom, it led to punishment. And yet, somewhere deep within, a few held on to something quiet and nameless. Not quite faith, not quite rage, but something that had not yet died. For them, this house was the entire world. A world without choices, without dignity, without windows. And even as the front lines shifted and the rumble of distant artillery reached their ears, they remained certain of one thing: no one was coming, because no one ever had. The morning of March 25 began like any other, gray, still, and heavy. The women woke before the sun, but no one came to unlock the hallway door. The usual sounds, the boots of guards pacing below, the barked orders from the kitchen, were absent. At first, they thought it was a test. Silence could be a trap. It had been before. Then came the distant rumble of engines. Not the soft idle of German trucks, but something deeper, more forceful, almost like thunder. It rolled over the ground and trembled in the floorboards. Some of the women pressed their ears to the walls, trying to decipher its direction. Others curled up on their beds, instinctively preparing for the worst. The first explosion shattered the stillness. A muffled blast, followed by sharp bursts of gunfire. Far away, but real. The women froze. A few glanced at each other without speaking, their eyes wide with something between fear and recognition. War was near again, but this time it wasn't the Nazis advancing. Something was changing. Another hour passed. The noise outside grew closer, then stopped. No footsteps upstairs, no locks turning, just the sound of breathing in the cramped rooms. Someone began to cry quietly, not from pain, but from the unbearable tension, the kind that came before every new horror they had ever known. And then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unfamiliar. Heavier than the guards, but without the drunken stagger or stomping authority they had learned to read. These steps moved carefully, as if uncertain of what they might find. The women didn't dare speak. Some moved to the corners of the rooms, pressing their backs against the walls. One reached for a hairbrush like a weapon, though her hands shook too much to hold it. The door opened without warning. A man stood in the doorway, wearing green instead of gray. His helmet was different. His skin was darker than they expected, and his gun hung low, not raised. Behind him, more figures appeared. None of them shouted. None of them moved with violence. For a moment, no one breathed. The man didn't speak right away. He looked at them, not with hunger, not with disgust, but with confusion, sympathy. He took a step back and gestured behind him. Moments later, a woman appeared, her uniform marked with a red cross. She looked younger than some of the women in the room. Her eyes scanned the space slowly, as if counting the souls inside. The nurse raised her hand slowly and placed it over her chest. She didn't approach. She simply stood there, still and calm, as if waiting for them to understand. One of the women, Amelia, dropped to her knees, not in submission, but from something breaking loose inside her. She whispered something in Polish, too quiet to hear. No orders were given. No threats followed. The nurse nodded once, stepped aside, and let in light from the hallway. Real sunlight, not the filtered strips through cracks. It washed over the floor like something sacred. And yet none of them moved. They had lived too long in a world where every kindness was followed by pain. The man lowered his weapon completely and pointed gently to the stairs, then to the door at the far end. He said something, soft, unsure, but the words meant nothing. What mattered was his face. He looked afraid, not of them, but for them. That expression alone shattered something in the room. They stayed frozen for minutes after the soldiers left. Slowly, painfully, one of the women stood up. Another followed. They crept toward the doorway like animals approaching the edge of a trap. But instead of bullets, they found blankets. Instead of shouts, they found quiet. The silence was not a threat anymore. It was the absence of cruelty. For the first time in years, the door was open, and no one was waiting on the other side with a demand. They didn't smile, they didn't speak, but they stepped forward. Not because they believed they were free, but because the world had changed, and they needed to know if it would let them live. The hours following the first encounter were disorienting. The women remained in the upstairs rooms long after the soldiers had passed through. No one forced them to leave. There were no shouted commands, no threats. That, in itself, felt suspicious. They waited for the other shoe to drop, for someone to laugh coldly and drag them back into the routine. But it never happened. Mountain soldiers moved through the building with careful steps. They spoke in a language the women didn't understand, but their tone was different, soft, uncertain. Some carried food, others carried blankets or medical supplies. Every gesture was cautious, as if approaching a wounded animal. The men kept their distance unless absolutely necessary, letting the nurses lead the way. It felt unreal. One of the women, Helena, peeked out of the room and found a tray of food left on the floor. It wasn't the watery broth or stale bread they were used to. It was warm, thick, unfamiliar. She didn't touch it at first. Then she whispered to the others. They crept out together, 6 of them, barefoot and silent. When no punishment came, they carried the tray back inside. The medics eventually came upstairs. All were women. They wore uniforms and badges the prisoners had never seen before. Some spoke halting German, enough to ask basic questions. Most of the women didn't answer. They sat on their beds, back straight, hands in their laps. They had learned long ago that attention from strangers usually meant pain. Even being looked at made some flinch. When a nurse extended her hand to check a wound, the recipient recoiled violently. Years of conditioning couldn't be undone by a kind voice. The soldiers and medics realized this quickly. They stopped trying to touch without permission. Instead, they sat in the rooms with them, waiting, offering, not demanding. One nurse brought a small mirror. She placed it gently on a windowsill and stepped back. None of the women moved to pick it up, but they stared at it, wide-eyed, as if seeing a relic from a lost world. Many hadn't seen their reflections in years. The idea of owning something as intimate as a mirror felt like a joke or a test. Trust came slowly, in pieces. A woman who hadn't spoken in days whispered her name to a medic. Another allowed her wrist to be bandaged. The smallest acts felt monumental. Each gesture had to be earned. The Americans didn't always understand the depth of the trauma, but they learned quickly to do less, to wait more. Later that day, the women were moved downstairs, not by force, but by invitation. A warm room had been prepared. There were cots and pillows, a wash basin, clean clothes folded neatly. The soldiers turned their backs while the women undressed. For the first time in years, no one watched. Still, no one smiled. No one wept openly. They moved with hesitation, as if testing the reality around them. The fear hadn't vanished. It had simply been numbed by confusion. Freedom was too large to grasp all at once. It felt foreign, almost dangerous in its softness. They weren't ready to believe they had been saved. That kind of belief was a risk they couldn't afford. They were waiting for the correction, for the slap, the shout, the order. But hour after hour, it didn't come. And that silence, kind and persistent, was what began to undo the years of captivity more than any words ever could. The physical condition of the women was far worse than the soldiers had anticipated. Emaciated frames, open sores, infected wounds, and eyes dulled by trauma. None of it could be fully captured in medical reports. Some weighed barely 80 pounds. Others could not walk without support. Many had untreated diseases that had silently eroded their bodies for months, even years. But it was not just illness that defined their state. It was the way they carried themselves. Every movement was cautious, measured, almost apologetic. They rarely made eye contact, and when they did, it was quick and fearful. The American medics began to understand that the damage ran far deeper than anything physical. These were women who had been taught their bodies were not theirs. Standard medical procedures had to be abandoned almost immediately. When a nurse reached to examine a woman's leg, the patient flinched violently and curled into a corner. Several refused to eat unless the food was left and the staff walked away. One woman tried to clean the floor as a reflex before accepting treatment. These were not acts of stubbornness, they were survival behaviors. New protocols were established. Only female staff were allowed to perform exams. Language barriers were navigated with gestures, pictures, and expressions. Consent became the core principle. Nothing happened without a nod, a look, or at least a moment of stillness. It made progress slow, but any other way risked re-traumatizing those who had barely begun to believe they were safe. Clean water became its own form of therapy. Some of the women stood in wash basins for long periods, just letting warm water run over their arms and legs. It was the first time they had bathed without an audience in years. One woman stood fully clothed in a tub and cried silently for nearly an hour. When the nurse returned, she was still standing, unmoving, water now cold. Reconnecting with their own skin took time. Changing clothes without being watched, sleeping without fear of a door opening. These things had to be relearned. The soldiers created privacy barriers, but even then, many women chose to sleep in corners or under furniture. The open space felt too exposed, too vulnerable. Safety, for them, had always meant invisibility. Nutrition required careful planning. Their digestive systems had been worn down by years of starvation and poor quality food. A normal diet caused nausea or pain. The medics adjusted by providing small, frequent meals: rice, soft bread, warm milk. Slowly, weight returned. Color began to bloom in their cheeks, but with it came a strange kind of guilt. Some felt undeserving of recovery. The nurses also learned to watch for nonverbal signals. A wince meant stop. A raised hand meant not yet. Healing had to be collaborative. Each act of care was a negotiation, and many women were afraid to ask for anything. They had been punished too many times for showing need. The idea that their bodies deserved comfort was foreign. One girl, barely 17, had a broken rib that had healed improperly months earlier. She had never mentioned it. It was only discovered when she fainted during a walk. When asked why she hadn't spoken, she looked confused and answered through a translator, "No one would have listened." The weight of that sentence lingered in the room long after she left it. Despite everything, there were moments of stillness that hinted at change. A woman letting a nurse braid her hair, another asking for more soap, someone singing under her breath while washing clothes. These were not loud victories, but they were real. Each one was a thread pulled loose from the knot of control the Germans had tied around their bodies. The reclamation of physical autonomy wasn't quick or dramatic. It unfolded in moments that no one else would notice: a pause before flinching, a hand reaching out voluntarily, a body standing upright in the sun. In those gestures, the women began to return to themselves. Not completely, not yet, but enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could one day feel whole. Even before liberation, the women had formed invisible bonds, fragile at first, then unbreakable. In the absence of family, they had become each other's lifelines. It was not friendship in the ordinary sense, but something deeper, born of shared humiliation and survival. The older ones protected the younger, teaching them how to avoid the worst punishments, how to endure. The silent understanding between them became the only stable ground they had. They shared food when there wasn't enough. They cleaned wounds with scraps of cloth torn from undergarments. They covered for each other during roll calls and whispered lullabies in the dark. In the bleakest nights, when screams echoed through the halls, they stayed close, not out of fear, but defiance. Their closeness was a rebellion against the isolation their captors had tried to impose. After the Americans arrived, those bonds didn't disappear. If anything, they grew stronger. The women clung to one another, sitting in small groups even when space allowed them to spread out. They helped each other eat, wash, speak. When one woman refused treatment, another would quietly explain, coaxing her with a soft word or a reassuring touch. Trust in strangers was impossible, but trust in each other remained sacred. Some of the medics noticed this and adjusted their approach. They stopped separating the women for examinations unless absolutely necessary. They brought in cots that could be pushed together. They allowed the women to remain in pairs or trios, knowing that solitude often triggered anxiety or despair. Healing did not happen individually, it was collective. There were stories they only told each other. Memories of home, of stolen youth, of who they had been before they were reduced to numbers. In the evenings, huddled under wool blankets, they would whisper in Polish, sharing fragments of lives they feared were gone forever. One girl had been a pianist, another a seamstress. One had wanted to become a teacher. These dreams, once extinguished, began to flicker again. They built routines amid recovery. Morning washing, shared meals, short walks around the courtyard when allowed. A nurse gave them embroidery kits, and soon the women began stitching again. Not uniforms, but flowers, names, symbols that meant something only to them. The act of creating was quiet and deliberate, a reclaiming of agency through small, beautiful things. Sometimes they sang, not loud, not for anyone else, just under their breath, songs remembered from childhood or church. These melodies drifted through the barracks like ghosts, softening the hard edges of memory. It reminded them they were not just survivors of violence, they were still women with culture, history, and voices. They also cared for the broken. When someone wept uncontrollably, the others did not shush her, they let her cry. They sat close, held her hands, gave her space without leaving her alone. Emotional breakdowns were treated with as much tenderness as fevers or wounds. It was their way of saying, "We understand, and you're not a burden." One afternoon, the youngest among them collapsed without warning. Panic rippled through the group until one of the older women calmly lifted her head, placed a damp cloth under her neck, and murmured words none of the soldiers understood. Later, when the girl woke, she reached for that woman first, not the nurse, not the medic, but the one who had shared her bread weeks before. It wasn't medicine that saved her, it was belonging. In this web of care, they began to reclaim more than health. They rediscovered identity. Through each other's stories, they remembered who they were. They braided hair, fixed buttons, shared memories. It didn't erase the past, but it made the present bearable. Their sisterhood was not built on joy, but on endurance. And in that endurance, something sacred had grown. These women had been stripped of dignity, language, freedom, but they had never let go of one another. And in that closeness, forged under the worst of conditions, they found the strength to begin again, not because anyone told them to, but because they had promised each other that survival would mean something more than just breathing. It would mean staying human, together. After the initial weeks of recovery, a new kind of uncertainty emerged. What came next? The American military command began organizing the logistics of repatriation. Some of the women had families to return to, towns that might still exist. Others had nothing. Homes destroyed, relatives missing, or worse, disgrace waiting for them simply because they had survived. The war had left them alive, but deeply marked. The question of where do we go now hung heavily in the air. No one said it out loud, but it was there in every quiet glance and hesitating gesture. Going back to Poland meant facing not only memories, but judgment. In their culture, purity was prized, and shame fell harder on women than on any occupying force. Some women, even the youngest, feared the rejection more than they had feared death. Officials tried to offer options: temporary housing in displaced persons camps, immigration pathways to the United States or other allied countries, assistance with paperwork, new documents, new identities if needed. But it was difficult. These women didn't just need shelter, they needed safety, anonymity, and time. Recovery would not fit into the standard repatriation plan. Several women, like Helena and Zofia, chose to stay in West Germany under American protection. They worked in field kitchens, sewed uniforms, tended gardens near the refugee centers. It was humble work, but it gave them structure and quiet. They didn't talk much about what they had endured, but they no longer whispered. Their voices were still low, but steady, and they spoke their names again. Others were taken in by humanitarian organizations, Catholic missions, Polish diaspora charities, medical recovery programs. These groups offered more than food or shelter. They offered privacy. For many, that was the most precious gift. The right not to explain, not to be pitied, not to relive the past in order to justify survival. It was enough to exist. Some women reunited with surviving family members, but the outcomes were mixed. A few were embraced, others were shunned or sent away. Stories began to circulate of women who married quietly, started new lives in small villages, never speaking a word of the war. And of others who disappeared into cities under false names, their wartime histories locked away like secrets too dangerous to speak. For the medics and soldiers who had helped them, the memory of those days never faded. Many wrote letters to their superiors describing the strength, dignity, and composure they had witnessed. These women had every reason to collapse, but they didn't. They braided each other's hair, shared tea when they had it, and sat in silence with a calm that unsettled the men more than any battlefield. Their legacy would not be found in public memorials or monuments. It lived in medical reports, witness accounts, and the quiet resilience of the survivors themselves. A few chose to testify later, contributing to war crime investigations. Others refused to say a word, but still left traces in the form of sewing patterns, cooking notes, or the careful way they folded laundry, always with precision, always with care. Years later, some survivors began speaking publicly, not just about the violence, but about the strength it took to reclaim a life. They spoke of the women who hadn't survived, of the sisters they'd never forget, and of the moment, forever etched in memory, when the door opened and no one demanded anything of them, when a stranger offered food with no strings attached, when they were called something other than a number. That was the true moment of liberation, not the tanks or uniforms, but the quiet acts that restored their humanity. A mirror placed gently on a table, a towel handed over without judgment, the chance to sleep without fear. Those moments, small as they were, became the foundation for healing. They would never forget what was taken from them, but they also refused to let it be the final word. In the lives they rebuilt, in the children they raised, the songs they sang, the meals they cooked, they stitched themselves back together, not perfectly, but beautifully. And in doing so, they became more than victims of war. They became witnesses, survivors, women with names, not numbers, women who had been silenced and then chose to speak.